A sudden burst of static crackled to life on the radio, tucked between battered helmets at the edge of the gearbench. Its urgent voice sliced through the lingering hush of early morning, bouncing off cool cement floors and half-lit glass. Danielle, standing by the engine with her gloves half on, froze as her name was faintly spoken. The familiar codes rolled out. Nothing dire, a precautionary alarm at the old Garrison Street bakery on the outskirts. It was the sort of call that let new firefighters prove themselves, and her pulse fluttered with anticipation and uncertainty. She glanced up, feeling the weight of her shiftmates' eyes, some hidden beneath brims, others direct and unblinking. These were men and women with years of service behind every silent nod, people who knew each other's rhythms and found comfort in routine. The sun barely crested the town's silent roofs, painting long shadows across the open doors of the bay. Danielle's boots struck the floor with quick, determined beats as she moved to the driver's side of the rescue engine, mechanics echoing anxiety she kept buttoned down tight inside. It was official, her turn behind the wheel. She buckled in, hands steady but damp against the worn leather of the steering wheel, as her captain approached. His hesitation was almost invisible, but it pricked her like a thorn. A pause, a small tongue pressed to the corner of his cheek, uncertainty masked as authority. He gave her a clipped nod, more perfunctory than proud, and murmured, "Easy drive. Garrison's a straight shot." Danielle answered with a thin, grateful smile. In the mirror, she caught the others gathering gear and whispers, their faces turned toward one another. She heard snippets. "First run? Hope she can handle it." The engine thrummed under her touch, waiting for her signal. Outside, the street was wide and empty, sunlight spilling across faded hydrants and clipped lawns. She pressed the ignition gently, feeling equal parts terror and hope. As the big red engine rolled from the bay, the air thickened with the ghost of last night's smoke, curling along the edges where sunlight met shadow. Danielle's grip on the wheel felt too tight, her knuckles pale against the deep leather, but the familiar pinch of rubber gloves brought her back to herself. The radio's wan static coiled around her heartbeat, each code spoken from dispatch sharp against the hush inside the cab. Flickering lights from the control panel blinked in and out, spilling amber and red across Danielle's face, casting fleeting patterns on the dashboard and warming the cool morning gloom. Outside, the modest streets of the town spread before her, lined with painted porches and maple trees, their leaves trembling in a low breeze. The bakery, though still far away, burned in her mind. She pictured windows glazed with morning condensation and the scent of old flour masking whatever minor calamity they'd been called out for. With every intersection she crossed, Danielle felt the firehouse's doubts trailing her, a quiet chorus behind the drum of the engine. She checked her mirrors, catching the stern faces of her shiftmates, one fiddling with buckles, another looking anywhere but her. Their silence wasn't hostile, just weighted with the kind of uncertainty that has no words. Streetlights overhead pulsed, but didn't fully illuminate the pavement, and the world outside the windshield seemed both familiar and distant, each storefront blurring from years of routine. A few curious neighbors paused along the sidewalk, squinting against the rising sun and the engine's strobes. Danielle inhaled the faint, acrid tang of old smoke clinging to the dash, mingled with the sweet hint of bakery air that crept in as they neared their destination. Shadows from overhanging branches stained the street in shifting patterns, and above all, the quiet inside the cab pressed close, a soft, nervous thing, barely held at bay by purpose and hope. As Danielle turned onto Garrison Street, the world outside the windshield came alive in scattered fragments. Over the bakery's faded awning, shadows twisted against walls painted gold by morning light. The lines of fire truck lights flickered in steady, unhurried rhythms, bathing cracked sidewalks and drawn window blinds in intermittent flashes of red. On the far side of the bakery, the owner stood silhouetted in the doorway, her features lost in the backlight, vague hands fluttering as if waving off invisible worries. Farther down the block, a small knot of onlookers gathered, their bodies little more than suggestion, motion behind frosted glass and shapes cast long by the sun. Smoke, pale and aimless, draped the bakery rooftop, curling in lazy ribbons that never quite settled, hinting at confusion, but not disaster. The rescue engine eased to a halt, and the world outside the cab pressed in. Distant voices, muffled through windows, the clang of metal as tools were unloaded, the hum of uncertain energy. Danielle, still behind the wheel, took it all in. Through the glass she watched her team's reflection slip past, the shapes of their movements, as much hesitation as routine. Inside the bakery, the inner lights flickered on and off, casting uneven brightness across counters, crowded with empty trays and half-seen faces. From afar, nothing was clear, just the sense of lives paused, of a morning unsettled but not undone. Up above, power lines trembled as another breeze picked up, the wires catching sunlight in a quick silver dance. In the midst of it all, Danielle steadied her breathing, feeling the quiet storm of chaos outside, disjointed shadows, darting lights, and the indistinct stirrings of a town holding itself together under the spell of uncertainty. Inside the cab, time seemed to slow, until the smallest things filled Danielle's world. Her hands, braced on the wheel, were steady at first. But as the engine idled, and the background noise of voices and distant footsteps ebbed and flowed, a faint tremor moved through her fingers. She pressed her palms into the warm leather, feeling not just the grain but the memory of all the calls it had carried before her. Each heartbeat felt slow, drawn out, echoing in the empty space above the dashboard. Danielle's breath came shallow now, soft puffs that clouded the lower corner of the cool glass window before clearing away again. She swallowed and set her jaw, noting how the tendons in her neck pulled tight, the sensation spreading down to her shoulders and locking across her back. The little click of the door latch as someone outside passed too close seemed magnified in her ears. Every sound, every motion became sharper but more distant, as though her senses were stretching thin between focus and overwhelm. Even the smell seemed deeper and more real, the faint rubber tang of gloves, the copper note of metal tools, a suggestion of sugar and smoke wafting from the bakery. Danielle felt the air shift as one of her peers opened a compartment outside, and the motion startled her, heightening the tension in her arms and bringing a rush of heat to her cheeks. Her boot, planted hard on the rubber mat, tingled where it pressed down, as if the pulse of the moment ran up through the soul. For a brief instant, she watched a droplet of condensation slide down the inside of the windshield, its slow motion matching her own slowed world. She listened to, and almost counted, each breath as it left her, willing her chest to rise more deeply, controlling the rush of nerves that wanted to rattle her into pieces. But beneath all that shaking energy, there was another layer, a determination that made her spine straighten, her lips press into a clean, quiet line, as she prepared not just for the work ahead, but for the 1,000 silent tests folded into every minute of this morning. Danielle sat perfectly still for one more moment, watching the senior firefighter through the smudged glass as he signaled her to stay put, and then headed toward the shifting shadows inside the bakery. The weight of that simple gesture, one practiced 100 times, but still so personal, hit her deeper than she expected. He'd always carried a quiet steadiness, serving as mentor but never needing to make a show of bravery. Yet as he disappeared past the bakery's battered door, Danielle felt a sudden pressure in her chest, a silent warning that lingered in the gap he left behind. She knew he might not return. Every call carried that risk, of course, and she'd told herself before that experience wrote these odds across their uniforms, their hands, their lives. Yet in this slow stretch of morning, with smoke curling above rooftops and fragile beams of sunlight spilling across the floor, the reality settled over her like an unwelcome blanket. She caught herself almost whispering his name into the cab's hush, as though the simple sound might pull him back safely. Her heart hammered in her ribs now, anxiety and protectiveness twining together until she ached with the urge to move, to prove she belonged not just behind the wheel, but as part of the close ring the team formed around each other in uncertain times. Danielle closed her eyes for a second, picturing the senior firefighter, the quick, careful movements, the way he smiled at new recruits, the patience he showed when others doubted her. That history colored the fear with hope. If anyone could read a situation, it was him. Still, doubt crept in and pressed against her certainty. She glanced into the side mirror, watching the blur of helmets and jackets around the bakery entrance, imagining the unseen dangers inside. Danielle felt the stakes stretching out wider than the emergency itself. This was about trust, about her place in the kind of family built not by blood, but by shared hardship. The urgency didn't make her reckless, but it did make her lean forward, hands braced and alert, every fiber of her being ready to act should the worst shadow cross the morning's uncertain calm. Before the call cracked open the shell of morning, Danielle stood in the firehouse kitchen, letting the soft hiss of the kettle seep through the walls. The rain had started just before dawn, each drop drumming a gentle rhythm on the old tin roof above her head. She poured water into a chipped mug, the steam curling upward to meet her face, eyes closed for a heartbeat as warmth traced her skin. It was a small ritual, a stillness claimed in the blue-gray quiet before a shift, when all that mattered was the swirling scent of tea and the world outside pressing softly on the windows. She leaned on the counter, hands wrapped around the mug, tracing the lines of old scars on the wood. The gentle clatter of someone rinsing a plate and the familiar creak of boots in the hallway drifted by, making the building feel lived in, full of secrets and laughter kept low. In that moment, she wasn't the new driver or the only woman on her crew. Just Danielle, breathing easy, letting herself be held by the ordinary hush of the morning. The rain grew steadier, tapping patterns just above her, calling forth a string of memories, childhood dawns spent curled beneath heavy quilts, the scent of wet earth, and her grandmother's voice humming old songs. There was something grounding in that sound, and in the ritual of waiting for the tea to cool enough to sip. She glanced out the narrow window, watching fat drops chase each other down the glass, streetlights blurring gold in their wake. Around her, the station hummed with routines, a laugh from the bunkroom, someone folding towels, the rustle of logbooks in the office. These were the subtle moments that made the risks bearable, the quiet, gentle anchors that steadied even the hardest days. Danielle took her first slow sip, savoring the taste and the heat. For a little while she was safe, and the world outside was subdued, suspended as if the rain itself had wrapped everything in a soft, protective cocoon. She stood by the bay doors with her tea cooling between her palms, the hum of rain fading beneath the steady thud of boots approaching. One of the older firefighters, a man with a sly grin and a face carved by laughter and smoke, paused beside her, eyeing her mug. "That your magic potion, rookie?" "Heard it helps with the nerves," he teased, his voice pitched just low enough to be kind. Danielle grinned, rolling her eyes in mock exasperation but didn't look away, accepting the gentle ribbing as a thread, connecting her to the long tradition here. Someone else passed by, offering no more than a quick nod, an unspoken approval, enough to say she belonged without the weight of words. At the table, 3 more sat together, mugs lifted toward their mouths, and the quiet warmth they shared, built over years of hard calls and harder recoveries, floated through the room. Laughter drifted up. A single line of a joke softened by the rain outside, and Danielle found herself smiling into her drink, the simple contentment of fitting in, seeping into her muscles. Between calls, time stretched and shrank in unpredictable ways. Some moments felt stuffed with noise and urgency. Others, like this one, were pressed thin by a gentle silence that said everything without speaking. The crew gathered loosely, comfortable in the way people are who've trusted each other with their lives. Danielle glanced across the kitchen, meeting the eyes of the senior firefighter as he folded a clean towel and set it next to the sink. A wordless reminder that life, even in the firehouse, was built on care as small as it was essential. He caught her gaze, winked, then turned back to some inside story with his peers. There was a kind of reverence in the silence that followed, each person present for themselves and for all the others, held there by a quiet and invisible web. In those small acts, laughter offered, a nod received, silence respected. Danielle understood the kind of team she'd joined, one stitched together not by heroism alone, but by the ordinary comforts and kindnesses that made everything else possible. Danielle's laughter faded, leaving a soft warmth beneath her ribs as she watched her team settle into their small routines throughout the kitchen. The older firefighter who had teased her paused at his locker, his silhouette outlined by the hallway light. She caught sight of him as he slid his hands into his coat pocket and lingered there, thumb and forefinger brushing the inside lining as if searching for something small and precious. He often did that when he thought no one was looking, shoulders slumping for a split second before he straightened and slipped back into easy camaraderie with the crew. Danielle wondered, in that fleeting moment, what he kept buried in those pockets. Rumor was, there was an old note he carried, never crumpled, never tossed away, a letter from someone who once waited for him every shift, back when the risks felt different and the idea of coming home wasn't something you learned to guard against. She found herself thinking about that note as she sipped her tea, wondering what words could be important enough to last through years of heat and rain and the weight of hard days. The story of the note was passed quietly, never spoken aloud while he was near, but everyone understood it in the way they understood old burns and mended gear, a badge of something private and enduring. Danielle realized she envied his quiet ritual. She had nothing like it, no talisman from another life to anchor her when the world grew too loud. She glanced down at her own hands, imagining what she might return to in the years to come. What reminders she would keep of mornings like this, gentle laughter amid the unknown, and the feeling of almost belonging. The rain had slowed outside, the storm giving way to streaks of sunlight painted across the wall above the lockers. For now, she let the world be small. This kitchen, this team, the memory of an old note folded deep in a pocket, and the hope that all of them, in one way or another, would have something worth holding on to. The sense of safety in the firehouse shattered with the shrill interruption of static on the radio, loud and unexpected. Every conversation trailed away as heads turned, eyes going alert in a single shared breath. Danielle felt the familiar snap inside her, the way clarity descended with each call. Over the clatter of distant coffee cups, a dispatcher's voice came through, calm, clipped, unmistakably tense. Engine 2, report to Garrison Street Bakery. Possible entrapment reported. The words coiled through the air and landed heavy on every set of shoulders in the room. Danielle's heart seemed to flip once, then again, as she set her mug down with more force than she meant to. The team responded with practiced speed, each member folding into their roles. Gear, checks, clipped questions and answers that left nothing to chance. The camaraderie from a moment before was still there, but now it was sharpened, pressed to its highest purpose by the possibility that someone inside that familiar storefront might be waiting, afraid, needing them. Danielle tossed her jacket over her shoulders, her hands working almost automatically, though her mind spun on the single phrase, possible entrapment. Her peers gathered around her, everyone's eyes on the task at hand. But she caught the older firefighter near the engine door, his hand briefly brushing his pocket in that same unconscious search before setting his jaw and meeting her gaze with a nod. He didn't need to say anything. The understanding was old and deep, woven through every firehouse in every town. As Danielle climbed behind the wheel, the radio crackled again with a follow-up. Reports of someone missing, not seen since the oven alarms first screamed. The uncertainty pressed hard against her chest as she powered on the engine, lights flickering against dim walls and reflective yellow paint. This was the moment where routine met the unknown, and as the siren called them out into the morning, Danielle focused on the road ahead, every muscle primed by both nerves and the certainty that whatever waited, they'd meet it together. A hush lingered as the team moved toward the engine, and with each step, the mood in the bay shifted. Danielle blinked away the lingering haze of tea and old laughter, sliding arms into her coat, the smooth fabric suddenly feeling crisp and unfamiliar against her skin. The older firefighter, usually relaxed, with a half grin tucked in the corners of his mouth, now wore an expression carved in resolve. His eyes, just moments ago, soft with memory and routine, snapped to attention. He checked his gloves with practiced precision, nodding once at Danielle, not as reassurance, but as a quiet order to focus. Around them, movements synchronized, boots laced, radios clipped, helmets lifted from their hooks. The light through the doors sharpened as the sun finally pushed through gray clouds, sending a clear signal. This was no longer a morning for stories or silence. Inside the cab, Danielle saw her own reflection in the side window. The warm, uncertain gaze she'd held a few minutes ago had transformed. Now her eyes were sharp and clear, shaped by the urgency of the call and the glances she shared with her crew. She steadied her breathing, grounding herself with the memory of every practice run and every quiet lesson handed down in early dawns and late nights. The roar of the engine as it started was a drumbeat in her chest. Outside, her team climbed aboard in silence, no laughter, no more gentle teasing. Just the familiar assurance of people who knew what was at stake. Danielle's hands, which had trembled when stilled by worry, now moved with calm intent, sliding over controls and switches. Their shared calm was gone, replaced with something leaner, stronger, a collective focus, distilled and ready, that would carry them toward whatever waited beyond the edges of the routine. Each member of the crew slipped into the ancient rhythm of preparation. Danielle tugged her gloves, knuckles creaking as she tightened the leather around her wrists, pulling each finger snug until the fabric became a second skin. She pressed the Velcro down across the back of her hand, the familiar rip and snap a quiet drumbeat in the morning hush. All around her, others performed the same silent rituals, a habitual check on the jacket's zipper, soft clinks of metal buckles locking into place, belts cinched twice for certainty. Someone tested a radio, adjusting the dial so that only the sharpest signal would get through. Danielle glanced at the helmet in her lap, tracing the scuffs and faint scratches skimming its surface, each mark a memory. She slid it over her head, dark hair pinned neatly beneath, and twisted the strap below her chin until she felt the gentle click of safety, the pressure, a reassuring weight. For a moment, everything paused, the world shrinking to the containment of their own gear, breaths drawn in and held tight behind lips, pressed to the edge of focus. It was the calm before action, a space so quiet, she could almost hear the rush of her own pulse. Danielle found comfort in the shared choreography. The soft pat on her shoulder as one teammate moved past, the hush of a deep exhale as another pulled his collar high, everyone moving with intention and respect. Helmet visors slid down in unison, faces dissolving behind reflexive gestures and the glint of tempered plastic. Together they rose to their feet, boots thumping on the polished truck floor. For all the uncertainty swirling beyond the bay, the what-ifs, the possible flames, and silent worries, here there was only the solidity of ritual, and the feel of breath contained, hearts braced, and a brief unity born of readiness. With every small adjustment and click, they built a moment of trust, sealing themselves inside the certainty that for whatever waited on the other side of the radio, they would face it side by side. With every buckle fastened and helmet secure, the warm world of the firehouse faded behind them. The engine's heavy door swung shut, sealing away the last hints of laughter and the kitchen's lingering heat. Danielle slid behind the wheel, the comforting glow of the station lights replaced by the harsh white wash of headlights on blacktop. Her gloves squeaked faintly against the steering wheel as she gripped it, feeling the cold seep through the thick glass despite the engine's steady internal hum. Out in front of her, the station bay doors parted, spilling light into darkness before snapping closed once the truck had cleared the threshold. The fire truck rolled forward, red lights sweeping over dew-speckled grass and silent driveways. Its siren, sharp and unwavering, tore through the stillness, claiming space on the roads and in the hearts of those who heard it. The transformation was complete as they left the familiar behind. The night felt bigger now, shadows stretching farther, and the air colder, sharper, even inside the truck. Danielle leaned into the work, watching the world blur by in streaks of yellow and silver, fog drifting low around the bakery district as the engine's heat barely brushed away the chill. The streets were emptied by the hour, each passing streetlight marking time with a rhythm she kept pace with in her chest. Her crew settled into the steady silence of professionals deep in focus, broken only by clipped radio checks and the soft, controlled cushion of their breath in the cab. Through the windshield, the headlights revealed little, just the next bend, the next cross street, the bakery's outline finally coming into view. Danielle felt the weight of her team with her, the stark comfort of their presence cutting through the uncertainty outside. No longer wrapped in warmth, they charged down the cold road, drawn by the need that waited in the night. The cab was thick with the hush of private thoughts as the world swept by beyond the windows. Danielle felt every bump in the road, each small jolt reminding her that she carried more than equipment tonight. She carried the hopes and trust of the people riding behind her. She thought of her mother's cautious pride, the quiet phone calls after each shift, the way her voice always lingered just a beat too long before daring to say goodnight. She remembered the bakery on calmer mornings, the scent of sugar heavy in the air as bakers opened up, unaware then that she'd soon be called to their door in the quiet dark. Each familiar landmark outside became a point of memory, the bus stop where she once waited as a student, the corner store her father used to visit when she was a child. The present moment seemed to stretch, filling up with the soft noise of what had come before, hopes, fears, and all the silent promises she'd ever made to keep going, no matter what waited at the end of the ride. Around her, the crew fell into the kind of silence that was more presence than emptiness. Danielle didn't need to look back to know each person was lost in their own string of thoughts, playing back old calls, running through checklists, perhaps remembering someone who'd been in need before. The older firefighter beside her sat rigid, gaze fixed ahead, but his hand unconsciously tapped his thigh in time with the engine's vibration. Maybe thinking of the note tucked in his pocket, maybe counting breaths, maybe picturing someone's face far from this cold road. The hum of the tires and the rise and fall of the siren seemed almost like a lullaby, coaxing each memory awake. In this moving bubble of light and hope, every beat of silence was shared but sacred. No words were needed, their purpose was understood, written not just on uniforms or radio logs, but across the patchwork of moments that made them a team. Danielle focused forward, letting memory and resolve flow together, bracing them all for whatever the bakery's shadowed door might reveal. The spinning red lights outside flickered like warnings on the edge of Danielle's vision as she neared the bakery, her mind conjuring the worst-case scenes that training and instinct ingrained over sleepless nights. She couldn't keep herself from picturing flames clawing up the bakery's walls, devouring the old woodwork, smoke billowing against the glass until it blotted out the morning. In her mind's eye, she saw kitchen towels and sacks of flour igniting, syrupy smoke pressing downward as fire alarm bells wailed into useless noise. She imagined what it would feel like to step inside, ceiling tiles dropping as they burned, the air thick as syrup, heat pressing at her face with a suffocating certainty. The vision tightened her chest, tightening her grip on the steering wheel as a quiet question circled. Would they get there in time? Would she make the hard decisions with the ease her team needed from her? Even worse than the imagined flames were the fears that grew in silence, the possibility of exits blocked by collapsed beams, doorways tangled in fallen racks of bread, the person reported missing curled up somewhere unseen. Danielle pictured someone behind the counter, trapped by heat and fear, pressing an apron to their face as smoke slid across the floor. She saw a hand slapping at a stubborn jammed back door, breath growing shallow with every minute lost to chaos. She imagined the sounds, a faint cough, the ragged shouts of her team, the fire crackling as it raced through hidden walls and crawl spaces. The urgency of these images burned beneath her practiced calm. Danielle knew that on every call, the monster in her mind was only as real as her next 10 seconds choices. She drew a slow, practiced breath, blinking her way back to the world of flashing lights in the bakery just ahead, steadying herself not with hope, but with discipline, and the trust that her team, just steps behind, were running through the same terrible pictures, each ready for whatever the morning demanded. As the truck slowed for the final turn, Danielle caught a glimpse of the older firefighter beside her, his jaw clenched, his fingers still tap-tapping his thigh, in a rhythm she'd come to recognize as nerves carefully disguised as focus. In the fleeting wash of a passing streetlight, she saw his eyes darken, not with fear, but with memory. Long ago, on another cold morning, he'd waved goodbye to his mother at the edge of a small house trimmed in faded blue, her hands wrapped around a mug on the doorstep. He remembered the way she pressed a note into his palm, folded so tightly it was soft at the corners, her eyes lingering on his face as if to memorize every line. "Be careful," she'd told him, her voice steady though her hands had trembled. She'd smiled, hiding the same uncertainty Danielle now felt on calls, trusting that her son would come home even as she fought the deeply rooted worry that sometimes, someone doesn't. That was their last real goodbye. She'd passed within the year, leaving the note, a simple 3-line blessing, still tucked in his gear, carried like a small shield against everything he could not control. For Danielle, watching him in the rearview mirror, that memory played out in the silence, its weight and grace both familiar. She thought of her own brief, complicated goodbyes, her mother's hand holding tightly to hers at the airport, a wave through blurred glass, old promises not to worry. Danielle wondered what she might carry with her through all the years ahead, what unspoken words, what tiny gestures might become her own secret touchstones for courage when the night ran long. Behind the older firefighter's still face, she glimpsed whole histories of love and loss, the small, lasting gifts that outlived fear and danger. The past hovered in the cab, woven quietly through the tension and flashing lights. No one spoke, but Danielle knew that every firefighter brought someone's memory along for the ride, a quiet hope holding them close, no matter how far from home they found themselves. The truck slowed, bumping gently to a stop just feet from the bakery. The world seemed paused, every second thick with the echo of memory and the press of possibility. Danielle felt it coil inside her, an ache, a promise growing stronger the longer she held the steering wheel. She flexed her hands and set her jaw, locking eyes with the older firefighter through the half-lit cab. Their eyes met for a breath that felt like a silent conversation, the kind that didn't need words or even a nod. Through the front glass, the bakery's windows glowed sickly yellow, shadows twitching behind smudged panes. The scene asked a question, and in return, Danielle felt something anchor in her chest. The stories of other nights, losses woven through the firehouse and whispered by shared ritual, tugged at her, but she answered with a quiet vow. Not this time. Not her. It was more than hope, more than courage, something willed into being by need, and the refusal to let another ordinary life slip away. Danielle climbed out, boots striking the pavement with a certainty that steadied the rest of her team. She swung her helmet under her arm, breathed in the cold air, and focused on the flicker of movement inside the bakery. The vow hummed through her every motion, an unspoken promise to herself, to the woman possibly waiting inside, and to the people behind her who believed in her more than she sometimes believed in herself. Each step toward the bakery was heavy, with a grace she wasn't sure she'd ever earned, but she carried it, fiercely. In the quiet before action, as her team assembled behind her, Danielle let the vow fill her, not this time, using it to steel her spine and soften her fear, ready to meet what waited beyond the glowing door. The bakery, usually so warm and welcoming in the glow of morning, looked strangely vulnerable beneath the swirl of engine lights. The front door hung half open, caught on a weathered welcome mat, creaking in the uncertain breeze. Smoke trailed in faint ribbons from above the door, slipping upward into the cold air but never fully obscuring the golden glow from inside. A handful of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some wrapped in thin robes, others with arms crossed tightly against their chests. Their faces, etched by worry, hope, and the relief that comes from knowing help has arrived, reflected the pulsing red beams thrown by the idling truck. Whispers passed quietly from one person to the next, hands rising briefly to cover trembling lips as they waited for any sign from within. Inside, the light flickered in uneven patches across the countertop, half-eaten pastries abandoned in haste, and the bell over the entry silent as the grave. The chaos Danielle had imagined in the truck felt softened here, changed by the slow, measured movement of smoke and the tentative way the fire clung to corners, more stubborn than savage. The smell of burned sugar and damp flour drifted out into the street, mingling with the cold and carrying something more fragile than fear. For the neighbors on the sidewalk, every small sound, a footfall, the ring of a tool, the low call of a firefighter's voice, was thick with meaning. People pressed a little closer, careful not to get in the way, searching every glance for news. In this chilly, waiting dawn, the line between those inside and those watching from the curb blurred, joined by longing for safety, for rescue, and for the familiar comfort of the bakery's door closing solidly behind them once more. The crew stepped from the truck into the crisp morning air, tools slung low and eyes sweeping the scene. Danielle felt her own body fall into the rhythm of the team. No need for words, no wasted movements. One firefighter traced the edge of the door with a gloved hand, testing for heat, while another knelt swiftly beside a side window, searching for hints of flame or a way in. The captain, solid and precise, circled to the back, already visualizing the interior, tallying exits and possible hazards as he moved. Danielle caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the bakery's dark glass, visor down, face set. She exchanged a look with the older firefighter, a nod, a tilt of the chin, and that was all it took. Years of training clicked into place, making communication as effortless as breath. Their motions echoed each other, a pair moving to lay out hose, another setting up the vent fan, Danielle positioning herself at the threshold, muscles coiled and ready. All around, tiny signals passed. A thumb extended to signal clear, a shoulder brush to say stand by, a finger tapped twice on the door's frame to warn of changing conditions. They listened to the building's groans. The skitter of glass underfoot, the thickening of smoke overhead. Each step inside was calculated. Every small action building on the next, woven together into a safety net made nearly invisible by practice. As they worked, the world outside narrowed to a tunnel of focus. The glow of the emergency lights, the arc of the door swinging open, the patchwork of voices and tools at the ready. Danielle felt the sturdy presence of her team close behind, their wordless unity, casting away some of her fear. Here, in the calm logic of their preparation, danger was just a problem to solve, together as one. Danielle moved through the threshold, crouching low as the shadows of the bakery closed around her. The smoke was rich and warm, thick with the bittersweet burn of sugar and something older, sharper, wood charred and paper curling away. Crawling behind the counter, she brushed aside a tray and found a photograph, its edges singed and image soft with water damage. The faces in the photograph, caught in a moment of laughter, arms entwined at a family table, were mostly gone, their smiles blurred and eyes empty. Only one part remained clear, a name scrawled in looping handwriting along the border, the kind of inscription that meant the picture had meant something, been carried or displayed. Danielle's own pulse jumped as she realized the name was the same one from the dispatcher's report, the missing woman they'd been sent to find. The paper stung her gloved fingertips, fragile but heavy with meaning. For a moment she felt frozen, the helplessness of not knowing if it was already too late, threatening to overwhelm all her training. A voice rose through the haze, a distant cough, maybe, or just the complaint of old boards under heat. But Danielle could have sworn she heard her own name whispered in the swirling smoke. She blinked hard, forcing herself to push past the memory of her mother's voice calling her home on stormy nights, past the ache of every goodbye, and rose to her feet. The photograph, half burned but refusing to disappear, felt like a challenge and a promise. Somewhere inside this haze, someone waited, hoping for rescue, hoping perhaps simply to be remembered. Danielle tucked the photograph into her jacket, her breath shallow as she followed the thread of smoke deeper in, every step driven by the urgency of that written name. The quiet pledge, unspoken but clear, that she would not let memory or fear outlast the chance to save a life. Danielle paused for a breath at the smoky threshold, senses narrowed to the pulse in her ears and the thick, sweet tang of burning sugar. In that moment, the doorway was so much more than wood and glass. It was a line traced straight through her chest, fear on one side, hope on the other. She remembered the countless times she'd heard her instructors say, "Every step in is a step for someone else." But now, those words were not just about training or duty, they became her prayer. She stepped through, boots sinking into flour-dusted tile, leaving the chilly blue dawn behind her. Smoke curled around her helmet's rim and her eyelashes, softening everything she saw, daring her to hesitate. She could have turned away and no one would have blamed her, but Danielle leaned forward instead, letting courage rise, choosing at this door not to surrender to fear, but to side with hope, not just for herself, but for the woman whose name she carried against her heartbeat. Inside, the air was close and confusing, thick with memory and the quiet stories trapped inside scorched walls. Every reflection and flicker of flame along the bakery's glass felt like a heartbeat, a plea. The further Danielle walked, the more she realized this wasn't only a rescue for someone else, it was her own private crossing, out of doubt and into possibility. She moved with purpose, boots careful yet bold, every bit of training bright in her mind but powered by something deeper, the belief that what she did here mattered, even if it was witnessed by no one but the woman waiting, frightened and unseen. The smoke parted just enough for her to glimpse the scattered glow of emergency lights filtering in from the world she'd left. Danielle kept going, breathing hope with every shallow lungful, fingers brushing her jacket to feel the burned photograph, knowing that on the other side of fear, every step forward was an act of faith in what she could give and in what might be saved. The smoke inside the bakery was dense and gritty, curling around Danielle's helmet and crawling under her collar, pressing sticky against her throat and eyes. Each breath came shallow and hot, edged with the taste of scorched sugar, bitter pastry, and the harsh chemical bite where flour dust met flame. Around her, the world reduced to inches, a narrow tunnel of gray swirling with frantic shadows, her flashlight beam cutting a thin, trembling path through it all. With every shuffle forward, her boots stuck to tiles softened by water and fire, the surface beneath her feet both slick and unpredictable. Even the smallest movement sent the smoke swirling anew, filling her nose and stinging her lungs, making it hard to focus on anything but the need to go slowly, deliberately, trusting the ritual of her breath and the memory of the bakery's old familiar corners. Somewhere overhead, the beams gave a warning, timbers creaked and popped, one letting out a crack so sharp that Danielle's heart stuttered in her chest. Bits of plaster drifted down in soft, feathery clumps, settling on her shoulders and brushing over her visor in faint, ghostly marks. The walls, once painted in gentle pastels, now streaked with soot and sweat, felt closer than they ever had in daylight. Every board seemed to groan beneath the shifting weight, every window distorted by heat and coughing with loud cracks as the glass trembled. Through it all, Danielle listened to the great living hush of the building. Fire's sporadic hiss hidden beneath the low, patient hum of old wood, struggling to hold on. Fear pressed close, as real and physical as the heat itself, but she pressed forward, each sense sharpened to the raw edge of survival. Yet even in this tangle of sound and smothering dark, Danielle kept her focus, every movement measured, guided by hope, duty, and the thin silver hope that what lay ahead was still within reach. Danielle moved forward, with each careful breath, her body trained to follow the slow, steady pattern drilled into her through sleepless nights at the academy. She counted the seconds for each inhale and exhale, feeling how the rhythm settled her nerves and sharpened her focus. Yet beneath that practiced calm, her heart was jumping, pounding so hard it almost echoed through the heavy layers of her turnout gear. She felt the tension in her shoulders and legs, the animal urge to hurry battling the voice of patience that whispered from memory, "Go too fast, and you can't go back." It was a difficult harmony, mind guiding the muscle, instinct urging her on, emotion threatening to spill over at any jarring snap or sudden cough in the smoke. Her hands, gloved and ready, didn't shake, but she could feel the strain each time her fingers tightened on the halogen bar or pressed her radio button. Inside that strange space, time slowed and thickened, allowing her to notice everything: her own shallow pulse, the hiss of steam, the way the light danced at the edge of her vision. Doubts and determination warred inside her as she moved. She searched every shadow, eyes burning but senses painfully alive, always listening for the smallest cry for help. Each step forward felt like a promise, the memory of a burned photograph pulsing against her chest, the echo of her mother's warning steadying her stride. Danielle tried to ride the edge between fear and composure, not letting one wash out the other. With every slow, purposeful breath, she made space for both worlds: the wild, racing certainty that lives might hang on her choices, and the fragile confidence that she could do what needed to be done. All around her, smoke pressed closer, dense, impatient. But inside, Danielle pressed harder, with her own chosen calm, anchoring herself to every lesson learned and every moment of hope she had carried to this place. Danielle's turnout gear, once heavy but reassuring, now dragged at her with the weight of water and smoke. The fabric clung to her knees and elbows, saturated from the spray of the engine's hose and the sweat gathering beneath her collar. Each step became a battle, boots squelching across blackened tile, the soles slipping on puddles grown murky with ash and flour. Her shoulders protested under the strain of the air tank, straps biting into her skin, but she kept moving with a stubborn patience, refusing to give in to fatigue. Every movement was deliberate, a decision made against the exhaustion creeping through her muscles, her body burning from the effort to keep upright and alert. Shadows flickered across her visor, smoke pooling at her feet and rising again, swallowing her silhouette each time she dropped low to scan beneath counters and tables. Breathing became a challenge of its own. Each inhale filled her mouth with a metallic tang, her lungs aching from the effort to pull thin air through the mask. The every breath was hot, scorching the back of her throat. She could feel her heart racing in protest, pounding stubbornly, as if willing her to hold on a little longer. Vision blurred with sweat and grit as embers winked through the darkness, pushing her to trust her hands when her eyes failed. Every step felt slow. Bones aching, calves dragging, her knees tight with effort as she propelled herself deeper into the haze. Still, Danielle clung to her purpose, the thought of the name on the photograph steadying her, reminding her that every struggle in this room was a fight worth having. Her battered body and burning lungs screamed for rest, but her resolve pressed her onward, inch by inch, hope leading her forward into the fire, no matter how heavy the cost. Danielle inched forward until her flashlight found a shape smaller than a shadow and far more alive, a woman crouched behind the low counter at the bakery's rear. The woman's hair was streaked with flour and ash, her skin ghost pale beneath the shifting tapestry of smoke and red emergency light. One trembling hand pressed a small silver locket against her chest, its chain lost behind soot-streaked fingers. Her other hand gripped the edge of an overturned tray as if it might anchor her to the world outside, while the walls creaked and the heat drew closer. Her eyes were wide and liquid, fixed on Danielle with a blend of hope and disbelief, a silent question glimmering in their dark depths. Could she really be safe now? Each shallow breath the woman took shuddered visibly, the thin rise and fall of her chest out of rhythm with the distant sounds of boots and breaking glass. Danielle knelt low, trying to make herself less frightening, holding her gloved hand palm out, gentle and slow. The woman seemed almost fragile enough to drift away on the smoke, but, anchored by the locket, she didn't move, only blinked through the haze with a wordless plea. Danielle's voice, muffled but soft, urged encouragement. The practiced assurances of rescues past blending with honest warmth she felt in this singular moment. "I'm here. I'll get you out," she promised, voice steady as she reached out. The metallic shine of the locket caught the beam of light, flickering like a keepsake from another life, a hope pressed close through the worst kind of night. The woman's fingers curled tighter around the locket, knuckles white, and at last her pleading eyes squeezed shut in relief. Tears cut fragile trails through the soot on her face. Every line of her body radiated fear, exhaustion, and a stubborn refusal to give up hope, all channeled into a single look, a silent prayer that help had truly come. In that moment, the distance between them was no longer measured in smoke and rubble but in trust, and Danielle bridged it with gentle words and careful hands, the vow she carried now doubled, meant for them both. Behind Danielle and the fragile woman, the building's bones began to protest, shouting their warnings into the rising haze. The piercing crack of a timber overhead was followed by the deep groan of stressed beams, each sound louder than the next, echoing across flour-dusted floor tiles and rattling metal pans. Smoke thickened in hungry layers, rolling in from the broken window and seeping through broken tiles above, smothering every breath with the urgency of time slipping away. Shadows from the firelight danced wildly now, flaring brighter as the flames found new corners. Danielle felt the temperature rising, heat crawling up the walls, licking at the base of her boots, threatening to make each second heavier. She pressed closer to the woman, sheltering her as best she could, voice low and determined. "We have to go now, stay with me." Every instinct screamed for speed, but every lesson held her firm. She could not rush the woman, whose breath came shallow and quick, whose hands shook as Danielle guided her upright. Behind them, a beam split with a sound sharp as lightning. Sparks swirled down with the dust, brief constellations in the swirling dark. Danielle slung the woman's arm over her own shoulder and scanned the room for their safest exit, mind racing through blueprints and escape plans as quickly as the smoke closed in. The weight of urgency pressed hard on both of them, each step backward a balance between care and panic. Her team's voices crackled dimly through her radio, the world outside a chorus of directions and alarms. Still, Danielle locked her focus on the path ahead, heart pounding with every thunderous crack overhead. She carried the woman forward with a promise as fierce as the fire itself. "You are not alone. We'll make it out." Each breath drawn in that thickening smoke was an act of hope, and every step was timed not by fear, but by the unbreakable will to reach daylight once more. With the woman trembling at her side and the roar of the building sharpening by the second, Danielle paused at a crossroads near the shifting shadows of a half-collapsed doorway. The air grew thicker, and new flames crawled hungrily along the wall closest to their planned escape route. Smoke pressed in with a physical weight, reducing the world to flickers, her own pulse, the woman's small frame clinging to her, the searing promise of the outside world barely glimpsed through the swirling haze. Danielle's training told her to cut their losses and run now, to follow the clearest line to the exit before the bakery sealed itself completely with heat and fear. Yet her heart, steady, full of the vow she'd carried in, reminded her of the woman's pleading eyes, the locket gripped tightly, the way her hand trembled as if every step forward borrowed courage from a promise yet unspoken. Danielle's mind raced with risk. If they left now, they might survive, together. But one false move, one moment's hesitation, and the window would close, leaving the woman trapped. Hope turned only to memory. The flames hissed a challenge, the ceiling above them groaning with fatigue. Danielle had already felt the heat bite through her jacket, her lungs tightening with each drawn breath. She studied the woman's face, eyes etched with trust, desperate, but still clinging to the hope Danielle represented. There was no time to search for an easier path or to call for the team's help and wait. The world had narrowed to this decision, echoing the choices she'd imagined in every sleepless night. Danielle squeezed the woman's shoulder with a steady resolve. Even as fear clawed at her, she knew the choice she could live with. "Hold tight," she whispered, voice both instruction and promise. She risked everything in that moment, drawing the woman into her side and moving deliberately into the thickest patch of smoke toward the nearest exit, refusing to let doubt or fear dictate the shape of their escape. It was the kind of choice forged in hope, in duty, and in the deep conviction that saving even a single life matters more than the weight of any danger faced alone. Danielle pressed forward, pulling the woman close, their steps slow but certain as they moved through the thickest part of the smoke. The world shrank to a tunnel of grit and heat, every inch behind them claimed by the hungry reach of fire. Flames flashed at her periphery, but Danielle tuned out everything but the path ahead, one breath, one forward step at a time. She kept her arm tight around the woman's narrow shoulders, feeling every tremble and shallow gasp as proof that hope was still alive between them. The bakery's doorway shimmered through the haze, a rectangle of pale, growing light that beckoned like the surface after a long, desperate dive. With a final surge of determination and strength that felt almost not her own, Danielle led them into that light, away from the weight and sorrow of the fire. The change was immediate and overwhelming. Cool air rushed in to replace the suffocating heat, and urgent shouts from her waiting team filled the morning in place of the roar of collapsing timbers. The woman sagged heavily against Danielle, tears streaking her soot-marked cheeks, locket still clenched to her chest. Danielle breathed in the clean air with awe, each inhalation a reminder that she and the woman were not only alive, but transformed by survival. As they crossed fully into the arms of daylight, every touch, her teammate's steady grip, the comforting wrap of a blanket, felt new, gentle, and full of meaning. For both of them, the burning bakery faded into memory as something was restored. Faith that even in the depths of fear, hands can find each other, and hope can be pulled, gasping, fragile, but alive, back into the world. Just as Danielle led the woman toward the glowing promise of daylight, a sudden, violent crack split the air, a deep, splintering roar that echoed through the shell of the burning bakery. The linoleum beneath their feet sagged sharply, warped by the relentless heat and the weight of water from the firefighting hoses. For an instant, Danielle felt the sickening drop as the floor gave way beneath her back foot, her body jerking down toward a dark void. Her legs scrambled for balance, boots slipping on a patch of melted tiles and ash, one knee buckling as she instinctively shifted her grip to pull the woman tighter into her side. Panic flashed in the woman's eyes, and from somewhere behind them, a shower of sparks rained down, lighting her plea into something desperate and wordless. Danielle's hands slipped for a split second, the woman's body nearly tumbling toward the exposed, burning joists below. The woman's cry, raw and sharp, pierced the chaos, mingling with the roar of flames and the sharp shouts of Danielle's team on the other side of the smoke-blurred doorway. For a horrible heartbeat, doubt crept in. Had she miscalculated, led them both too close to disaster in her urgent drive to save? Danielle drove her free knee into a solid plank. Teeth clenched, muscles burning, every ounce of her training fighting the black vacuum pulling them down. She shouted over her shoulder, "Hang on! I've got you!" The bakery's battered door seemed impossibly far. But Danielle harnessed the cry for help as fuel, anchoring herself with both arms and dragging the woman up and out of the gap. The floor groaned again, but held just enough. With a final, wrenching effort, they tumbled together out of the failing room and into the fresh air outside. In the space between collapse and rescue, it was faith, grit, and that single desperate cry that tipped the balance back toward hope. As Danielle clawed her way from the sagging, blistered floor, the sound of glass shattering cut through the roar behind her. Through the haze, the arm of her crew partner, a sturdy silhouette outlined by frantic light, thrust in through a narrow window just above the bakery's far counter. His gloved hand, dusted with ash and spidering with the glow of emergency strobes, stretched toward her, steady and sure despite the chaos. Danielle didn't hesitate. She locked her grip on the woman with one arm and reached for her partner with the other, the promise of escape now more tangible than the burning world under their feet. His voice, muffled by mask and distance but brimming with determination, called, "Just a bit closer! Don't let go!" The window, cracked but open just wide enough, framed his outstretched arm, a lifeline illuminated by the shifting dance of red and gold. With one final, wrenching effort, Danielle pressed the woman's trembling hand into that waiting grip. Her partner anchored their rescue, bracing his legs and hauling the woman through with a practiced gentleness that broke through fear. Danielle felt the rush of cooler air pour in around her face as her own hands were pulled next, strong and certain, by the familiar grasp she trusted more than words. On the other side of the window, her team created a bridge of arms and quiet encouragement, guiding them out into safety. At last, all three tumbled through, the old glass shuddering behind as the bakery's cries faded into the background. Relief staggered Danielle's breathing as she knelt beside the rescued woman, daylight bright upon both their faces. By teamwork, trust, and timely intervention, the way had cleared and hope, not just for survival, but for connection, had carried the day. As Danielle and the woman tumbled from the smoky heart of the bakery into the embrace of dawn, the glaring noise of chaos faded into a hush. The air outside was crisp and impossibly fresh, a gentle balm against their burning lungs. Danielle's first real breath was a soft gasp, the taste of clean oxygen almost sweet after so much smoke. She pressed her forehead to her gloved hand, grounding herself in the coolness seeping through the fabric. The woman next to her did not let go, her soot-stained fingers gripping tightly to Danielle's sleeve, as if afraid that safety was only a momentary gift. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The only heartbeat was the steady, relieved panting shared between rescuer and rescued. Behind them, the bakery groaned one final warning, flames retreating in the presence of the morning, and the red swirl of emergency lights. The noise of the crowd faded to background hum, replaced by the small, sacred sound of survival. For Danielle, the relief was neither loud nor triumphant. It was settled in the silence, felt in the gentle pressure of the woman's hand, the soft click as someone passed her a blanket, the cool wind drying sweat on her brow. Around them her team moved quietly, tending to wounds, guiding each other out of habit and care. The woman's teary eyes searched Danielle's face, wordless gratitude pouring through every exhausted line. Danielle squeezed the woman's hand in return, silently promising that this moment, this precious pause, right at the edge of had-been disaster, would not be forgotten. No words were needed between them, the act of holding on was enough, the connection between two people preserved in the gentle hush that followed the storm. In the settling quiet, the world was remade not by sirens or applause, but by breath shared, hands gripped tight, and the undeniable proof that they had made it out, together, into the light. Kneeling on the dew-cold grass, Danielle watched the woman carefully, the seconds stretching with every silent heartbeat. For a painful moment, the world seemed to narrow to the fine lines of the woman's face, eyes closed and lashes trembling against soot-blackened cheeks. Danielle held her own breath, reading the subtle motions of the woman's chest, a shallow rise, a pause, then another faint lift, just enough to prove that life had not yet left her behind. Time slowed with each uncertainty, the air around them stilled as if everyone nearby, even the sky and wind, was holding back to watch and wait for the smallest sign. Only when the woman's lips parted and a frail gasp cut the silence did Danielle's own lungs begin to work again. It was barely more than a whisper, but it drew a shiver of hope through the whole team, and Danielle stayed close, her gloved hand gently brushing the woman's hair aside so she could breathe easier. A slow movement followed, hesitant fingers twitching at the woman's collarbone, searching instinctively for reassurance, for Danielle's steady presence still at her side. Danielle took the woman's hand in her own, anchoring it with a gentle pressure, never letting the connection falter for a second. It was this touch, a living, moving thread between two survivors, that gave proof to what words could not yet say. The woman's eyelids fluttered once, then again, before drifting open just far enough to catch Danielle's gaze. Their eyes met, silent tears mingling with soot and relief, as the woman squeezed, weak, but unmistakable. Even as medics pressed it gently in around them, checking pulses and murmuring quiet encouragements, Danielle would not let go. Every shallow breath, every slight squeeze, every trembling motion was confirmation of life, fragile but stubborn. A small miracle pulled from the fire, held now in open morning air. As the adrenaline drain overtook her, Danielle's knees suddenly gave way, forcing her to sit hard on the wet grass beside the woman she had carried from the smoke. Her breaths came in uneven waves, the air that once burned her lungs now feeling impossibly clear, almost sharp in her throat. Hands that had pulled a life from fire now began to tremble, the shock of what they'd done settling beneath her skin. The dark grit of soot streaked her knuckles and creased in the lines of her palms as she pressed them hard into the earth to steady herself. She could feel the heartbeat that had thundered so fiercely now fluttering with exhaustion and relief, her whole frame vibrating with a cocktail of fear, hope, and gratitude for what wasn't lost. Around her, shapes moved softly, team members, medics, neighbors. But for a moment, Danielle was inside her own quiet, letting the cost of the rescue seep down to her bones. Tears slipped unhindered down Danielle's cheeks, mingling with the black trails of soot, leaving new lines along her jaw that gleamed in the soft daylight. She sat with her head bowed, shoulders shaking as silent sobs gathered in her chest, not out of humiliation but of everything carried and finally released. The woman's hand, small, still trembling, reached out, brushing Danielle's arm, grounding her gently and silently thanking her all at once. In that touch, Danielle found something sturdy enough to cling to, even as her vision blurred, and the sounds of recovery swirled at the edge of her awareness. She didn't try to wipe the tears away, she let them fall, allowing herself this moment of honesty and release. For just a little while, her shaking hands and weak knees weren't signs of weakness, but proof of the love and gentleness that belonged in any true act of courage. In this raw pause between disaster and healing, she offered her tears to the day, letting them mix with soot as a tribute to all that had been risked and, finally, saved. The aftermath hung over them all, like a hush too deep to disturb, the sunlight breaking gently on the circle of firefighter, rescued woman and tired crew. No one cheered or called out congratulations. The street was thick with the kind of silence that makes room for what words cannot hold. Neighbors looked on at a distance, some holding one another, others simply standing with hands pressed to their mouths, eyes red with worry and relief. The firefighters clustered close, tending wounds and checking on one another, but mostly exchanging long, quiet glances that meant more than any backslap or boast. Danielle sat in the damp grass, soot-streaked and shaking, with the woman's hand resting in hers, a fragile human bridge between the living and the nearly lost. This silence was not cold or empty. It was sacred in its grief and awe, making space for the weight of what had been endured. Among the team, a few tears mixed with grime, some knelt in stillness, and others simply stood, breathing, blinking hard, allowing the morning to remind them they were still here. Danielle's heart beat in her ears, matched by the faint sound of the woman's breath, thin but steady. In that collective, wordless pause, all understood that this kind of rescue was never neat or easy. Every soul gathered there paid silent tribute, not only to what had been saved, but to all the moments when saving was not possible. It was in this hush, as much as in any siren's wail or life pulled from the fire, that the team found their meaning, together in the quiet aftermath, awestruck by both the fragility and the stubborn perseverance of life. The truck rolled quietly down familiar streets the bakery left behind, as the dawn spread gold across the roofs and sidewalks. Inside the cab, every seat was filled, each firefighter settled into the deep, echoing stillness of exhaustion and gratitude. Danielle leaned her head back against the cool window, eyes half closed, her mind replaying every moment, the smoke, the cry for help, the woman's hand in hers, until the memories flickered into something soft and distant. Her fellow crew members sat in silence, hands folded or resting heavy on their knees, faces unreadable in the half-light. Each of them had given something in those strange, tense minutes. Now they carried it home, their breaths sinking in the hush, every heart full in ways words could never explain. The radio, usually alive with chatter and jokes, stayed silent, except for the gentle static that filled the background, its emptiness comforting, an agreement to hold this stillness together. No one spoke as the firehouse came into view, its doors yawning open to welcome the tired team back into the bright arms of morning. Faces were turned to the street or out the window, each person searching the world for a bit of peace, a sign that life had resumed while they had been elsewhere, changed but present. Danielle glanced around at her friends, her family in uniform, seeing the unnamed stories in the way someone's eyes lingered on the sunrise or in the way another's hand gripped the end of the seat by reflex. When they finally stepped down from the truck, the motion was slow, careful, as if waking from a deep, shared dream. In the soft light, everything felt both fragile and strong, and the tired, unreadable faces of the crew glowed with the quiet pride of those who had done what needed to be done, and carried someone, each other, themselves, safely through the night. As the engine rumbled down the pale, empty street, Danielle's gaze drifted over to the older firefighter, his profile outlined by the rising sun cutting through the windshield. The world outside moved in slow blurs of color and quiet, but inside, memory snapped bright and immediate. She heard again the sound of her name carried on the radio, and saw the woman's eyes, wide, pleading, full of something fierce and true, as she looked at Danielle through the curtain of smoke, trusting her completely in a moment when both of their fates had balanced on an edge. Danielle's mind lingered on the electric jolt of that gaze, not just fear, but a tidal wave of hope, gratitude, and the simple, terrible need to be saved by someone willing to cross the fire for her. That look had carved itself into Danielle's memory as both a burden and a blessing, reminding her that in these silent rides home, every story they carried was written in the eyes of those who'd waited for help. The old firefighter, feeling the weight of her glance, met Danielle's eyes for a fleeting second. A silent understanding passing between them, old pain and new pride reflected back and forth. In that tiny pause, memories raced between them. The moment Danielle had locked eyes with the woman, and the moment years ago when he too had been on the receiving end of such a look. He remembered the first time his mother watched him walk into the fire, how she had trusted him despite the trembling in her hands, and he saw now in Danielle the same mixture of fear and resolve, stitched through with a deep kindness. For Danielle, the memory of the woman's desperate gaze, hanging between need and faith, was a promise she would always carry. As the lights of the firehouse drew near, that silent, unforgettable look echoed in the space between them, a through line from one act of courage to the next, a story that lived on long after the smoke had cleared. Much later, after the gear was cleaned and the paperwork settled into neat stacks, Danielle's ride home took her back along the familiar, winding streets of her own quiet neighborhood. She drove slowly, fatigue softened by a ribbon of cautious hope, watching the orange glow of sunrise start to pool at the feet of each porch. When she rounded the last corner, Danielle saw the dim yellow light on her front stoop, always left burning, whether she was there or not. It was such an ordinary sight. And yet, tonight, after so much fire and fear, the light felt like its own quiet miracle, a sign that someone inside believed she would come home. Danielle slowed to a stop, hands still trembling a little as she rested them on the wheel, letting the familiar glow seep into her tired bones. In the hush of morning, before birdsong or the clatter of garbage trucks, she allowed herself a deep breath of gratitude, looking through the windshield at the soft, steady beacon her house had become. Though the world outside her window was cool and calm, Danielle could feel the day's weight behind her, pressed against the shield of that porch light. It reminded her of all the times she'd left in the dark, promises unspoken, and all the times she had returned to find love quietly waiting. In the gentle shine, there was room for every moment from the bakery, the locket, the trembling grip, the silent hush after rescue, and room, too, for the memories that made her brave enough to walk into fire. She didn't reach for her bag or her keys. Instead, she sat there, for just a breath longer, letting the light remind her who she was before the call, and who she would always be after. Someone who runs toward need, yet is always, warmly, someone's hope returning home. The next shift arrived with a softness that belied the memory of smoke and alarm, the firehouse breathing easy as the team settled into familiar rhythms. Danielle found a small envelope tucked into her gear cubby, a note with careful looping script that unmistakably belonged to the woman she had carried from the flames. Hidden inside the fold was a simple thank you, and a promise. "Next week my pies will be waiting." The words were warm and light, and Danielle felt their comfort blossom in her chest like a long-missed embrace. Later that afternoon, a humble bakery box appeared on the station's well-worn table, its contents still warm, the scent of fresh apple and spice mixing with the aroma of coffee and boot polish. The whole crew, whether or not they'd been on that night's call, gathered quietly around, their gruffness softened by the sweet surprise, a tangible reminder that what they risk, and what they save, matters to someone, somewhere. Near the window, a single candle burned in the middle of the table, its flames steady and small against the broad daylight. Someone, without a word, had lit it, whether for luck, or memory, or simple thanks, Danielle couldn't say. It felt right, the little golden flicker standing watch as pieces of pie were passed hand to hand, stories shared with laughter and small silences. In every smile, every gentle nudge of a plate or refill of coffee, Danielle saw the threads of connection mended and strengthened, their quiet work illuminated by pie and candlelight. The letter sat folded in her pocket, its words a touchstone to hope renewed. As dusk gathered outside, she would remember this scene as the true heart of her calling, that small, ordinary acts, sharing a letter, baking a pie, lighting a candle, could bind a team, restore a soul, and light the way back home. When the kitchen grew quiet and the last crumbs of pie were gone, the older firefighter lingered at the table, his broad shoulders sunk beneath the soft glow of the candle. The others drifted off, some to laughter in the next room, others to the comfort of their bunks, but he stayed, cradling a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. In the hush, he stared at his hands, the strong, careful hands that had reached through shattered glass and blinding smoke more times than he could count. Old scars and new traces of soot marked his knuckles, stories layered atop each other like sediment. For a while he simply sat in this solitude, grateful that the night's rescue had ended in warmth and pie, yet haunted by the memory of hands he had not reached in time in years past. faces and names tracing the lines of his palms with invisible ink. He flexed his fingers, gazing at them with a mixture of reverence and mourning, every wrinkle a map of all he'd risked and gained and lost. Gratitude beat steadily in his chest, thankful for this job, this calling, and for teammates who knew silence could sometimes carry more weight than words or cheers. But as the candle's flame flickered and the kitchen's shadows pressed gently in, the old ache returned. That each moment of rescue brought memories of what could not be undone, what could not be held. Still, he remained at the table a little longer, letting the solitude settle. In that pause, with a glow of hope and regret mingling quietly around him, he allowed himself a final, silent prayer, one for the living, one for the lost, and the hope that, come the next call, his hands would be steady enough to keep holding on. In the quiet aftermath, while laughter echoed from distant hallways and the candle burned low, something invisible hung in the air above the empty kitchen table, a lesson learned by those who wait in the hush after the fight. Danielle, pausing near the doorway, looked back at her friend sitting alone in the steady warmth of the candlelight. She saw the curve of his shoulders, the way his gaze drifted not to the pie or the letter but to the past, layered deep inside his steady hands. The rescue they had shared was more than a heroic story, more than headlines or the grateful smile of a woman safe and alive. It was something that unlatched old doors, mended silent scars, and reminded them all that even through fatigue, fear, and grief, they could find their way back to connection. In that circle around a pie and a flame, hearts could be stitched whole again. Not by triumph, but by presence, care, and grace. Some rescues, Danielle thought, save more than a life. They restore hope in places worn thin, rekindle the courage to return, and offer proof that, even after all is lost or nearly lost, kindness can still close the distance. These moments remake the world in quiet ways, uncelebrated and unnamed, but felt, shared silently between those willing to answer the call. As Danielle stepped out into the fading light, the truth followed her, quiet and certain. Sometimes, the real victory is not in pulling someone from the fire, but in lighting a way home for every soul it touches. And so the firehouse became, once again, a place where people learned to hold on, to each other, to hope, and to the healing born from the gentlest acts of rescue. Long after the sun had faded and the kitchen had emptied, the rescued woman sat quietly in the warm, lamplit hush of her own home. Swaddled in a fresh blanket and sipping tea made by hands that still trembled slightly, she gazed out the window at the gentle flicker of her porch light. The night outside was calm, so unlike the chaos from which she'd been pulled just hours before. Her hands drifted to the silver locket at her chest, feeling its reassuring weight and the way its cool surface warmed against her heart. The memory of flames and smoke still danced at the edge of her thoughts, but it was not the roar of destruction she replayed most, rather the moment when hope found its way to her, embodied in a gentle voice and a steady hand reaching through fear. Each time she closed her eyes, the blur of pain and panic softened and faded, replaced instead by a memory so clear she could almost hear it again. The soft, determined knock through the haze, the signal that someone had come for her, that she was not lost or forgotten. It had sounded against the hard world of fear like a promise, simple, human, absolute. Now, as night settled gently over her quiet home, the rescued woman held that moment close. She remembered the fire. But most of all, the knock.